In this video tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to make the soldered hearts. This is an updated version of a video that I produced several years ago. I've learned a lot since that video was shot, and the video did not have very good videography. So I decided to go ahead and redo this video with new and updated technique and information. So you're going to start out with 2 matching pieces. You don't necessarily have to have matching pieces. There's nothing wrong with using pieces that don't match, but in this case, we're going to use matching pieces. Now, these pieces have been cleaned, and I put them into the pickle pot, which is a mild acid solution, and that ensures that I've got off debris and grease and grime and years of garbage that builds up on the silverware when it goes unused. You can also clean it off with some acetone or some alcohol. Just gonna give it a little bit more cleaning here with some 000 steel wool. Now, to determine what you want your heart to look like, you're going to take the 2 pieces and you're going to cross them over, and then just visualize how the heart is going to look when it is complete. If you want to have one that's long and thin, you're going to create an angle like this. If you wanted to make one that is shorter and wider, then you're going to create your angle like this. So I think I want to have the flowers from both pieces. So I think I will do them like this. So you're going to take a Sharpie marker and you're going to mark 2 spots. One is where this piece crosses over, where it crosses over at the top, and where it crosses over at the bottom. So I'm going to make sure I have all of that pattern in there. So that's going to be my top mark. And then I determine how long I want it to be, want the heart to be, and just play around with it. And that will be the bottom of my heart. So just grab a straight edge, even if it's just something like a piece of cardboard, and you're going to put those 2 marks, you're going to connect those 2 marks with your Sharpie marker, and that is going to be the line for you to cut. Okay, that is going to be your cut line. Now you're going to need to take a rubber mallet, and you're going to have to flatten down the tip. As you can see, that tip is curved. So I'm going to flatten down the tip with a rubber mallet. And same thing with my other piece. Now you can't always get them exactly flat, so you can use a nylon plier to pull that a little bit flatter. We're going to be gluing these pieces together, so the more surface that you have between, the more surface that you have to attach the pieces to each other, the better you are. So we're going to cut those, and I've got my trusty bolt cutters here. You don't want to cut it too short, even though the heart's only going to be this long. You don't want to cut it too short because we're going to cut with a jeweler saw, and you need something to hang on to when you're doing the cutting. So I'm going to take mine, cut them right about there. 18-inch bolt cutters, I find, is the easiest and fastest way to cut silverware. Okay, so there's my 2 pieces, and even though there's a little bit of a gap there at the top, I don't think that really matters. just so long as I have a lot of the surface touching one another. Okay, we're going to take a hot glue gun and put a big blob of glue right there, and we're going to glue these pieces together back to back. Okay, back to back. You want to make sure that the pieces are as close to perfect as you can get them. And that will make you have two exact matching pieces once that is cut. Okay, you're going to let that glue cool off, and then we're going to cut along the line there. Now you can cut with a jeweler's saw, you can cut with the mini bandsaw is a tool that I recommend. You can even use a Dremel cutoff wheel. Be sure you're wearing eye protection when you are making any of this jewelry. So I'm going to do this with a jeweler's saw, and we're going to cut that. You want to have your cut to be as straight as humanly possible. And the reason for that is we're going to be filing that cut edge. And the nicer you make that cut, the less filing you're going to have to do. Okay, we're here at the bench pin, and I have my jeweler's saw all ready to go. And I like to use a little bit of beeswax on my blade. And we're going to cut this piece apart. See which way I want to start here. We'll go this direction. Okay, just have a little bit more to go, but I think what I'll do is just open it up right there. Because I don't want to break my blade, so I just open it up right there, and I'm just going to pull that apart. So you're going to keep the pieces glued together at this point. Now we're going to file this cut edge, and the goal here is to get the coloring on the cut areas the same from front to back and from side to side. We have two exact matching pieces, so when we open it up and lay it out into the heart shape, the pieces fit together perfectly. So I have a large flat file that I'm going to be using to do the filing and get those edges nice and smooth. You can also use sandpaper if you don't have a file. Just know that it's going to take probably a little bit longer to sand the metal down with sandpaper as opposed to a file. This is called a bastard file. They're very easy to come by. You can go down to Harbor Freight and grab one. I believe this one came from Lowe's, and it was one of the Cobalt Tool branded ones. So what we're going to do is we need to lay the piece down, the cut side down, keeping it as perfectly perpendicular to the file. We're going to do long, slow, deliberate strokes so we ensure that we have excellent contact along the entire stroke. If you tip it just a little bit one way or the other, or you press too much on the front or press too much on the back, you're not going to get a perfectly flat surface. And you'll know that you didn't get a perfectly flat surface two ways. One is the color will not be the same all the way across the entire surface. If you move on from that and you try and put them together, you're going to find that you have a gap. Solder does not fill gaps effectively, so it is very important to get everything filed exactly right to start with. So you can see what I mean by difference in the color. So you have darker spots, lighter spots, and variations along the surface. That tells you that it is not perfectly flat. So you're going to keep doing this until you achieve a perfectly flat surface. Having the pieces glued together is great because you only have to cut once instead of twice, and your angle is identical on both pieces. And when you put it together, it's flush and perfect. Just keep working and checking and working and checking and working and checking. So you can see why I say it's important to get your cut work as good as you can possibly get it, so you have less chance of having to do a ton of filing. So I just want to show you an example where somebody might think, oh, those look really good. This here, this here, this, and this tip. Can you see how they're darker? That means we have not even filed those areas yet. Those are little dips in the metal. And if we were to take this apart and put these together as if we were making the heart and getting ready to solder the heart, solder is not going to flow into these areas here, and you're not going to get as perfect of a join as you can possibly get. Our goal is to have a seamless solder line with no spillover of solder and no gaps. Now, I recommend practicing on scraps before you start making hearts. The best way to do that is the pieces that you cut off. Make sure they're glued together still. Do your practicing on the scrap pieces, because it's a lot easier to throw away scrap pieces and not feel bad if you mess it up, as opposed to messing up your heart piece. So do your practice pieces on the scrap, and when you feel confident that you have achieved a nice solder joint that has no gaps and does not have a lot of sloppy solder work, then move on to your good pieces. We're getting there. Okay, so now you can see how the light reflects evenly all the way across from end to end. Okay, so now we're going to take the pieces apart. I've got a bench knife here, so all I'm going to do is just put the bench knife in and twist these pieces apart. Sometimes easier said than done. When you glue, it's best to just do a big blob of glue rather than try and get it thin and spread it out, because it's a lot easier to pick off a big piece of glue than it is a whole bunch of little tiny chunks. Okay, get that all apart. Now you're going to have a little bit of a burr, and you can feel it. You can even hear it here with your fingernail. You're going to have that on both sides on both pieces. We want to get that burr off of there, because if you don't, when your heart is finished, you're going to have this rough seam. And that is our objective, is to not have a rough seam. Now, I always like to run it across a little bit of sandpaper, and I should have done it while they were still together, but I'm just going to run it across. This is like a 240 grit sandpaper, just a little strip. Just very carefully, since I already took them apart. And I'm going to take that same piece of sandpaper, and I'm going to just swipe it along the edge until I get that burr off of there. Now, you don't want to bevel the edge. You only want to remove that sharp burr. Okay, usually just 1 or 2 strokes with the sandpaper is all you need. You'll have a much, much nicer looking seam if you don't have the burr. That little sharp edge there. If you find you've got more of a burr than that sandpaper is capable of removing, you can always use a file and just go lightly across the burr to remove any of a little bit of a ledge that's there. Okay, now my finger goes across without catching. All right, so we're going to do a little test fit here to see how everything looks. And we have a beautiful, beautiful seam there with no gap. Okay, so we're going to get this set up for soldering. Okay, we're going to be soldering on top of this fire brick. There is a link in the description below on where to purchase one of these fire bricks. Not all fire bricks are the same. You don't want to purchase a brick that is really dense and hard, because you won't be able to stick your pins in it. This is more porous and will allow us to put our pins in there. Let me get a nice clean spot there. We're going to be using T-pins and or U-pins to hold the piece down. It's extremely important to have the piece held in place, because they will naturally want to separate from one another when you introduce heat. Okay, so make sure your pieces are all clean. I would wipe them off one more time with some alcohol or some acetone, because now we've done a lot of manipulating. You might have a little bit of glue left on there, any dirty fingerprints, anything like that. You want to go ahead and get that cleaned off of there to ensure that they are clean for soldering. And just make sure those pieces are nice and clean. The keys to soldering are clean pieces that fit well together with no gap. And I mean, those are really your keys. Clean pieces, no gap. If you accomplish those 2 things, you can be successful at soldering. I know soldering is one of those things that is very frustrating for a lot of people, but there are just a few basic principles that if you follow, you can be successful at soldering. Okay, I'm getting up above my work here just so I make sure I've got these perfectly even. But if they're not even to start with, well, you solder them, that's the way they're going to solder, is uneven. Okay, Using T-pins and U-pins, or maybe just a combination of both. I'm not sure which. I'm just gonna put these pins in and see where we go. These are U-pins, and T-pins and U-pins both are nice because they have these little tops that push down and hold the piece in place. Now, some of you might be tempted to go across the bottom like this and push your pin down in there. You don't want to get pins on the surface where you're soldering, because you will solder your pin to the surface. Not a good thing. So let's see, I'm going to use a T-pin here and push that one down there, and one more T-pin, and that should do it. Another really important thing in soldering is to get everything set up perfectly. If you have a good setup, you'll have a much larger chance of success than if you just kind of sloppy halfway attempt to get the pieces together for soldering. Okay, stand up above my work. I want to make sure both of the pieces are flush with one another. Pins are holding everything tight. So this piece is not going to move now. Not going to move. Okay, we're going to be using a low melt temp solder. Melts at approximately 450 degrees, which is much lower than silver solder that you would be using for doing sterling. We are doing that mainly because we're working on silver plate, and the high melt temperature of even extra easy is enough to damage the plating. So we're using low melt temp solder, and it's a wire solder. It has flux in the core of the solder, but I have found that I get much better flow when I add liquid flux. Okay, liquid flux we carry. This is, we specifically recommend this for soldering stainless steel. So just a wee bit there, right in the seam. Make sure all your pieces are still nice and tight together. Okay. Now we're going to be heating with a butane torch, and this is what I have here. We carry this torch head on our website, and I've got a link below into where you can get butane canisters. So we don't even need any fancy soldering setup. So solder follows the direction of heat. So what we're going to do, and I'm just going to give you a little demo before we do it. What we're going to do is we're going to heat the piece up fully. And every so often we're going to test how hot the piece is. Once the piece has achieved the temperature that the solder melts at, the solder will melt and will automatically wick up the seam towards the top. And we're going to take our heat and we're going to direct it in this direction. We're going to direct it from the top. We're going to feed from the bottom. That way the solder will flow towards the heat source and it will go right up that seam there. Okay, I'm going to throw another couple pins on that. Because if it moves and you develop a gap, you're going to have to stop, clean your pieces, and start over. Okay, it's just that little bit of solder that I touched on there just made those pieces move. So we don't want that to happen. Put my fingers all over that. I'm gonna put another little dab of liquid flux on there. Okay. The entire piece. We're gonna touch it right where the tip of the heart is. Doesn't take very long for the piece to heat up. You're not going to be heating it up, it's probably not even for 30 seconds. Okay, I'm starting to get a little melt there. Okay, so it's starting to melt. I'm going to feed the solder in at the bottom. With the heat at the top, it just pulled the solder right up. Probably can't see it in the video. You'll see it better in person. So what you'll see is a shiny silver line develop as it fills in the gap, or as it fills in the seam up to the top. And by directing your heat up there, you're taking the solder that you're feeding in down here and you're pulling it up all the way into the seam. Okay? Do not move your piece at this point. You want to let it cool down. My recommendation is to let it cool down naturally. If you find you have, maybe just a tiny little gap at the bottom because you didn't get the tip just quite right, the solder is going to remain molten for at least 30 seconds. So you can always take your tweezer, give it a little pinch there at the bottom. That's where I tend to have difficulties because it can be very hard to get a perfect match at the tip. And sometimes if your piece is a little higher on one side than the other side, and the solder is still molten, you can take your solder pick, press down on that seam, and hold it until it doesn't move anymore. Okay, so you do have a little bit of opportunity to manipulate these pieces, but it's best not to have to do it that way. Okay. I don't recommend spritzing it with water, and the reason I don't is because while that solder is still molten in the seam, if you introduce a splash of water, you can splash some of the solder out onto the surface of the piece, which is almost impossible to do anything about. In sterling, we would be able to use some abrasive materials and remove excess solder. In silver plate, we really don't have that option because anything that's going to remove solder is also going to remove the plating. So I find it best just to leave the piece and let it cool naturally, okay? You can tell if it's ready by tapping the piece. If you see no movement whatsoever, you're probably safe to take your pins out. Still, be very, very careful, because if you do take your pins out and it moves, chances are you're going to end up having to solder again, and it just never seems to work out as well second time around. So I'm just taking my pins out. I'm going to scoop my piece out of there and let it continue to cool. If you want it to cool faster, if you get a steel bench block and lay it on the steel bench block, the metal in the block, in the bench block, is going to draw the heat out of the piece much quicker. Okay, once it's cool to the touch, you can go ahead and put it in some water, just plain water, and that's all you need to get off this debris. So what we have is just a little bit of burnt on flux here and some discoloration from the heat. We do not get true fire scale or fire stain because we're not heating the piece hot enough. So it doesn't need to be pickled. And it's cool to the touch. Alrighty, so I can just about guarantee you that if you put the piece in while it is still hot, you are going to break your solder seam. So I'm just going to get a little toothbrush. I'm going to go over to my sink and I'm going to scrub off any of this discoloration and burnt on flux. Okay, now we're going to get this cleaned up. Brass brush is one of my favorite things in jewelry. As far as a jewelry tool, I just find it so useful. And it's going to let me get into those little cracks and crevices and remove any dirt, anything left over from the soldering process. And let's take a look here. Look like I got a little bit of dirt down in there. No, maybe not. I guess that's just the pattern. Just the pattern, I guess. Okay, and do the same thing, clean off the back. Okay, I do have a little bit of excess solder back bottom area, and I'll tell you this is actually a good learning experience. I fed in too much solder, and you could see it didn't look like I really fed in much solder at all, but that little bitty seam is going to require a minute amount of solder. So any excess solder that does not go into that seam has got to go somewhere. So fortunately, it went on the back rather than the front. So I have a little bit of excess solder right there. So it's really super important to use as little solder as possible, because as you can see, too much solder's got to go somewhere. And it's not going to go onto your block because the solder is not attracted to the block. The solder is attracted to the metal wherever the flux is. So this is some 000 steel wool. Just clean anything off that's left. And at this point, you can throw this in your tumbler. You could go to your bench buffer and polish this up with white compound followed by red compound. And get it all polished and cleaned up. Now, if you were going to make this into a pendant, you could drill your holes now. You can drill them prior to soldering. It's really just a personal preference. Doesn't have to be one way or another. If you find that you have just a little bit of a sharp edge on the bottom there, you can take your file or your sandpaper and just touch up that tip. This also is really helpful because if you have a little bit of a gap down at the bottom, because like I said, it can be really difficult to get something so narrow to be perfectly flush. If you have a little tiny gap at the bottom, you can always file that back. So it's kind of a little workaround. So I just want to make sure I don't have any sharp edge there. And that is your completed heart. Now, some people would not like the seam. In sterling, we would be able to remove that seam with a number of sanding and polishing methods. But as I said before, anything that's going to remove something from silver plate is also going to remove the plating. So we're not going to do anything to try and eliminate that line. Now, you can always texture an area to blend that line in if it bothers you. Also, the choice of your silverware can make a difference. So in this one, the seam is relatively hidden in the pattern itself. In this one here, the seam is evident because, again, we've got some shiny surface right there. If you have any questions, as always, post them and I will be happy to answer them.